Have you ever wondered what drives people to risk everything, even their lives, for beliefs that challenge the most powerful institution of their time? In the rolling hills of medieval southern France, a religious movement emerged that would shake the very foundations of Christianity and ultimately face complete annihilation. They called themselves the Good Christians, but history remembers them as the Cathars, and their story is one of the most fascinating and tragic chapters in European religious history. Welcome back to Obscure Historiesa, where we uncover the forgotten stories that shaped our world. Today we're diving into the extraordinary tale of a people who dared to believe differently and paid the ultimate price for their convictions. The Cathars weren't just another heretical sect that briefly troubled medieval authorities. They represented something far more dangerous to the established order, a complete reimagining of Christianity that attracted hundreds of thousands of followers across Europe. But what made their beliefs so threatening that the Pope himself declared a crusade against them? What drove ordinary people to abandon everything they knew and embrace a faith that promised persecution and death? And how did a movement that once controlled entire cities and counted nobles among its leaders vanish so completely that for centuries they were little more than a footnote in history books? By the end of this series, you'll understand not just who the Cathars were, but why their story matters today. You'll discover how their revolutionary approach to gender equality, their rejection of material wealth, and their unique interpretation of Christianity created a society so different from medieval norms that it posed an existential threat to the Catholic Church. Most importantly, you'll see how their systematic destruction became one of history's most successful campaigns of religious genocide, erasing an entire way of life from the face of Europe. The story of the Cathars begins not in the sun-drenched valleys of southern France, but in the complex web of religious ideas that had been challenging Orthodox Christianity for over 1,000 years. To understand the Cathars, we must first journey back to the ancient world, where the seeds of their distinctive beliefs were first planted in the fertile ground of religious dissent. Picture the bustling markets of 3rd century Babylon, where a Persian prophet named Mani proclaimed a revolutionary vision of reality. Mani taught that existence itself was a cosmic battleground between two eternal forces: absolute good and absolute evil, light and darkness, spirit and matter. This wasn't the familiar Christian concept of a fallen world that could be redeemed, but something far more radical. According to Manichaean teaching, the material world was inherently evil, created not by a benevolent God, but by a malevolent force that sought to trap divine souls in prisons of flesh. These ideas spread like wildfire across the ancient world, finding eager audiences among those who struggled to reconcile the existence of suffering with belief in an all-good, all-powerful deity. Manichaeism offered an elegant solution. Suffering existed because matter itself was evil, and salvation lay not in redeeming the world, but in escaping from it entirely. The Roman Empire eventually crushed the Manichaeans with characteristic brutality, but ideas, unlike their human carriers, proved remarkably difficult to destroy. The dualistic vision of reality that Mani had articulated continued to resurface in different forms across the centuries. In the mountains of Armenia and the valleys of the Balkans, new movements emerged that shared this fundamental insight. The world was not one creation under one God, but a battleground between opposing divine forces. The Paulicians of Armenia embraced these teachings in the 7th century, creating communities that rejected the authority of the established church and practiced a radical form of Christianity based on dualistic principles. When Byzantine persecution drove them westward, they carried their beliefs into the heart of Europe. In the 10th century, a Bulgarian priest named Bogomil synthesized these ancient dualistic traditions into a coherent theology that would prove extraordinarily influential. The Bogomils, as his followers became known, developed a sophisticated religious system that combined Manichaean dualism with Christian symbolism. They taught that Satan, originally an angel in service to the true God, had rebelled and created the material world as his own kingdom. Humanity found itself trapped between these two realms, possessing souls of divine origin imprisoned in bodies crafted by the devil himself. This theological framework had profound practical implications. If the material world was Satan's creation, then the established church, with its elaborate rituals, magnificent cathedrals, and claims to spiritual authority, was not just misguided, but actively serving the forces of evil. The Bogomils rejected the authority of bishops, dismissed the sacraments as meaningless ceremonies, and proclaimed that salvation could only be achieved through direct spiritual experience, not through institutional mediation. These revolutionary ideas spread throughout the Byzantine Empire and beyond, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and missionaries who travelled the ancient trade routes connecting East and West. By the 11th century, Bogomil communities had established themselves across the Balkans, and their influence was beginning to penetrate into Western Europe through the complex networks of medieval commerce and communication. It was into this world of religious ferment and intellectual exchange that Catharism emerged in the 12th century. The movement first appeared almost simultaneously in several regions of Western Europe, the bustling cities of northern Italy, the commercial centres of the Rhineland, and most significantly, the culturally sophisticated courts of southern France. This wasn't mere coincidence, but reflected the reality of medieval Europe as a surprisingly connected world where ideas travelled as readily as goods along the great trading routes. In northern Italy, the cities of Milan, Florence, and other commercial centres had grown wealthy through trade with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. These cosmopolitan environments proved fertile ground for religious innovation, as merchants and scholars encountered ideas from across the known world. Italian Cathars, often called Patarenes after an earlier reform movement, established themselves in urban communities where their emphasis on personal piety and rejection of clerical corruption resonated with citizens who had grown skeptical of traditional religious authority. The German Rhineland, another major commercial region, saw the emergence of Cathar communities in cities like Cologne. Here, the movement attracted followers among the merchant classes and urban artisans who were drawn to its emphasis on personal spiritual development and its critique of ecclesiastical wealth and power. However, the political structure of the Holy Roman Empire, with its close ties between church and state, made it difficult for Catharism to establish the deep roots it would find elsewhere. But it was in the sun-soaked region of Languedoc, in what is now southern France, that Catharism would achieve its greatest success and leave its most enduring mark on history. The political and cultural landscape of 12th century Languedoc created unique conditions that allowed the Cathar movement to flourish in ways that would have been impossible elsewhere in medieval Europe. The Languedoc was not a unified political entity, but a patchwork of independent lordships, city-states, and county territories that owed only nominal allegiance to the French crown. This political fragmentation created spaces of relative freedom where alternative religious movements could establish themselves without immediately facing the full weight of royal or papal authority. Local nobles, many of whom had grown wealthy through trade and were influenced by the sophisticated court culture of the region, often proved remarkably tolerant of religious diversity. This tolerance wasn't merely political calculation, but reflected the unique cultural synthesis that had emerged in the Languedoc. The region lay at the crossroads between the Islamic world of Al-Andalus, the Byzantine Empire, and Latin Christianity. Through trade contacts with Muslim Spain and the Eastern Mediterranean, the courts of Languedoc had been exposed to philosophical and theological ideas that challenged conventional Western Christian thought. The famous troubadour culture that flourished in these courts celebrated not just courtly love, but intellectual sophistication and religious questioning. The language itself reflected this cultural complexity. Occitan, the local language of the Languedoc, was more closely related to Catalan and Spanish than to the French of the north, symbolizing the region's distinct identity. In this environment, the Cathars found not just tolerance, but active protection and support from the very highest levels of society. The Counts of Toulouse, the most powerful nobles in the region, became notable patrons of Cathar communities. Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, was so closely associated with the movement that Catholic sources accused him of being secretly ordained as a Cathar bishop. Whether or not this was true, his court certainly provided a safe haven for Cathar perfect and a centre for the spread of their teachings throughout the region. The Viscounts of Carcassonne and the Counts of Foix similarly offered protection to Cathar communities, seeing in their teachings not a threat to social order, but a form of spiritual refinement that enhanced the cultural prestige of their courts. This aristocratic support was crucial to Cathar's success, providing the movement with the political protection and financial resources necessary to establish permanent communities and develop sophisticated organizational structures. By the beginning of the 13th century, Cathar communities had become so well established in the Languedoc that they operated almost as an alternative church. They had developed their own hierarchy of spiritual leaders, their own educational systems, and their own networks of mutual support that spanned the entire region. In some towns, particularly around Albi, which would give its name to the entire movement, Cathars may have constituted a majority of the population. This success, however, would prove to be their undoing. As Catharism grew in strength and influence, it inevitably came into conflict with the expanding power of both the French monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reshape the religious and political landscape of medieval Europe and ultimately lead to one of history's most systematic campaigns of religious persecution. The Catholic Church's initial response to the growing Cathar movement revealed both the strength of the challenge it faced and the limitations of traditional methods of dealing with heretical teachings. Throughout the latter half of the 12th century, a succession of popes dispatched legates and missionaries to the Languedoc, confident that a combination of theological argument and moral authority would be sufficient to bring the wayward region back into the Orthodox fold. In 1147, Pope Eugene III sent one of the most prestigious religious figures of the age, Bernard of Clairvaux, to preach against the Cathars. Bernard was a Cistercian abbot whose reputation for sanctity and eloquence had made him one of the most influential voices in medieval Christianity. His success in preaching the Second Crusade had demonstrated his ability to move crowds and inspire religious fervour. Yet in the Languedoc, his mission met with polite indifference at best and open hostility at worst. The failure of Bernard's mission was a shock to the papal court. Here was a man who had convinced thousands to take up the cross and march to the Holy Land, yet he could not persuade the people of southern France to abandon their heretical beliefs. The problem, as subsequent observers would note, was not Bernard's eloquence, but the deep roots that Cathar teaching had established in the region. These were not simple peasants who had been misled by charismatic preachers, but sophisticated communities that had made informed choices about their spiritual lives. Pope Alexander III tried a different approach in 1178, sending a delegation of cardinals with full papal authority to negotiate with both the Cathar leadership and the nobles who protected them. This mission, too, achieved little beyond establishing the extent of Cathar influence and the determination of their protectors to resist outside interference. The papal legates found themselves debating with Cathar, Perfect, who demonstrated impressive knowledge of scripture and theology, making it clear that this was not a movement that could be dismissed as ignorant heresy. The Third Lateran Council of 1179 represented the Church's first attempt to deal with the Cathar challenge through formal ecclesiastical legislation. The Council issued decrees condemning Cathar teachings and authorizing local bishops to take action against heretics within their jurisdictions. However, the political realities of the Languedoc made such decrees largely meaningless. Local bishops often lacked the power to act against movements that enjoyed noble protection, and in some cases, they may have been sympathetic to Cathar teachings themselves. As the 12th century drew to a close, it became clear that peaceful conversion efforts were not succeeding. The appointment of Pierre de Castelnau as papal legate in 1203 marked a significant escalation in the Church's approach to the Cathar problem. Castelnau was not simply a preacher, but a lawyer monk with extensive experience in ecclesiastical administration and a reputation for uncompromising orthodoxy. Castelnau's mission represented a fundamental shift in papal strategy. Rather than simply preaching to the converted or attempting to win over Cathar believers through theological debate, he focused on pressuring the political authorities who made Cathar's success possible. His approach was to isolate the movement by forcing the nobles of Languedoc to choose between their local religious preferences and their relationships with the broader Catholic world. This strategy brought Castelnau into direct conflict with Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, the most powerful protector of Cathar communities. The confrontation between these two strong-willed men would prove to be the spark that ignited a conflagration, consuming the entire region and ultimately destroying the Cathar movement forever. The confrontation between Pierre de Castelnau and Raymond VI began as a battle of wills between two men who represented fundamentally different visions of medieval European society. Castelnau arrived in Toulouse with the full authority of Pope Innocent III behind him, expecting the deference that papal legates traditionally commanded from Christian rulers. What he encountered instead was a sophisticated court culture that had grown accustomed to making its own decisions about religious matters. Raymond VI was no simple feudal lord, but a ruler whose domains stretched across much of southern France and whose court attracted scholars, poets, and religious thinkers from across Europe. He had been raised in an environment where intellectual curiosity and religious tolerance were seen as marks of noble refinement, rather than dangerous heresies. To him, the Cathars were not enemies of Christianity, but fellow seekers of spiritual truth, whose austere lifestyle and moral dedication deserved respect rather than persecution. The Count's initial response to Castelnau's demands was diplomatic but firm. He acknowledged the papal legate's authority in matters of church doctrine, while maintaining his own right to govern his territories according to local customs and traditions. This position, reasonable as it might have seemed to Raymond, was unacceptable to Castelnau, who had been sent to end the Cathar movement, not negotiate with its protectors. As their exchanges grew more heated, the fundamental incompatibility of their positions became clear. Castelnau demanded that Raymond expel all known Cathars from his territories, confiscate their property, and hand over their leaders for trial by church authorities. Raymond countered that many of these supposed heretics were his own relatives, loyal subjects who had committed no crimes beyond holding unconventional religious beliefs. How could he persecute people whose only offense was living lives of exceptional moral purity? The papal legate's response revealed the hardening attitude of the church hierarchy toward the Cathar movement. Moral purity achieved outside the framework of orthodox Catholic teaching was not virtue, but deception, he argued. The very fact that Cathars lived such apparently exemplary lives made them more dangerous, not less, because they led others away from the true church through the seductive power of false sanctity. Their rejection of Catholic sacraments and ecclesiastical authority constituted rebellion against God himself, regardless of their personal conduct. This theological argument held little weight with Raymond and his court, who had observed Cathar communities firsthand and seen nothing but beneficial effects on local society. Cathar perfect were known throughout the region as healers, teachers, and mediators who helped resolve disputes and cared for the sick and poor. Their emphasis on non-violence had actually reduced the levels of feudal warfare that plagued other parts of Europe. From Raymond's perspective, persecuting such people would be not just unjust, but actively harmful to his realm. The deadlock between legate and count reflected a deeper conflict about the nature of religious authority in medieval society. Castelnau represented a vision of Christianity in which the Roman Catholic Church served as the sole legitimate interpreter of divine will, with all secular authorities subordinate to papal commands in matters touching on salvation. Raymond embodied an alternative model that had developed in the culturally diverse environment of the Languedoc, where political rulers maintained the right to make independent judgments about the spiritual welfare of their subjects. As negotiations continued through 1207, both men found their positions hardening. Castelnau, frustrated by what he saw as Raymond's obstinate protection of heretics, began threatening increasingly severe sanctions. He spoke of excommunication, interdict, and the possibility of papal action to remove Raymond from power entirely. These threats, rather than intimidating the Count, seemed only to strengthen his resolve to resist what he viewed as unwarranted interference in his legitimate authority. The situation was further complicated by the involvement of other regional nobles who found themselves caught between competing loyalties. The Viscounts of Carcassonne and Béziers, the Counts of Foix, and numerous lesser lords had to weigh their traditional allegiance to the French crown and the Catholic Church against their local interests and personal convictions. Many had family members who had embraced Cathar teachings, or had themselves been influenced by the movement's emphasis on spiritual authenticity over institutional conformity. Meanwhile, the Cathar communities themselves watched these political maneuverings with growing concern. The perfect and their followers understood that their survival depended on continued noble protection, but they also recognized that this protection came at an increasing cost to their patrons. Some Cathar leaders counseled their communities to prepare for persecution, while others hoped that diplomatic solutions might still be found. The winter of 1207 to 1208 saw tensions reach a breaking point as Castelnau made his final demands of Raymond VI. The papal legate insisted that the Count demonstrate his orthodoxy through specific actions: public penance for his past protection of heretics, the immediate expulsion of all known Cathars from his domains, and active participation in their persecution. To refuse these demands would result in excommunication and the release of Raymond's subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Raymond's response was characteristic of the man and the culture he represented. He would not abandon subjects who had shown him nothing but loyalty simply to satisfy the demands of a foreign authority. If the price of maintaining his honor and protecting his people was conflict with Rome, then so be it. His ancestors had carved out their domains through their own courage and skill, and he would not betray that legacy through cowardly submission to papal threats. The meeting that would seal the fate of both men took place in January 1208 at the Abbey of Saint-Gilles, one of the great pilgrimage sites on the route to Santiago de Compostela. The choice of location was significant, as the abbey represented the deep Christian heritage of the Languedoc that both men claimed to defend. Yet their final confrontation there would demonstrate how completely their visions of Christianity had diverged. Castelnau arrived at Saint-Gilles with a small retinue, confident that the sacred setting would lend additional weight to his ultimatum. Raymond came with a larger party that included several members of his household guard, a detail that would prove fatally significant. The meeting began formally, with both men maintaining the courtesy expected of their stations, but quickly deteriorated as Castelnau repeated his demands, and Raymond again refused to comply. The papal legate's final words to the Count of Toulouse were both prophecy and threat. He declared that Raymond's protection of heretics had placed him beyond the pale of Christian society, and that the Church would find other means to accomplish what diplomacy had failed to achieve. Raymond's response, according to contemporary accounts, was equally uncompromising. He would rather face the wrath of Rome than betray the trust of his subjects, or compromise the independence that was his birthright as a ruler of the Languedoc. The two men parted as enemies, each convinced of the righteousness of his cause and the intransigence of his opponent. Neither could have imagined the scale of the catastrophe that their conflict would unleash upon the lands and people they both claimed to serve. The stage was now set for events that would transform their personal dispute into one of medieval Europe's most devastating religious wars. On the morning of January 15, 1208, Pierre de Castelnau prepared to leave the Abbey of Saint-Gilles for his journey back to Rome. He had failed in his mission to bring Raymond VI to heel, but he carried with him detailed reports on the extent of Cathar influence and the determination of their noble protectors to resist papal authority. These reports would provide the foundation for the much more drastic measures that Pope Innocent III was already contemplating. As Castelnau's small party made their way along the banks of the Rhône River, they were overtaken by a group of armed riders. Contemporary accounts differ on the exact circumstances of what followed, but the outcome was unambiguous. The papal legate lay dead by the roadside, struck down by a spear thrust that contemporary chroniclers attributed to a squire in the service of Raymond VI. Whether Raymond had ordered the assassination, or whether it was the impulsive act of a retainer seeking to defend his lord's honour, would be debated for years to come. What mattered for the immediate future was that Pope Innocent III now had the pretext he needed to transform what had been a religious dispute into a holy war. The murder of a papal legate was an unprecedented act of violence that demanded unprecedented response. Word of Castelnau's death reached Rome within weeks, carried by the surviving members of his entourage, who painted the assassination as part of a broader conspiracy by heretical forces to destroy the authority of the Catholic Church. Pope Innocent III, already frustrated by the failure of peaceful conversion efforts, seized upon the murder as evidence that the Cathar movement and its protectors had placed themselves permanently outside the bounds of Christian civilization. The Pope's response was swift and decisive. In March 1208, he issued a papal bull that would reshape the religious and political landscape of medieval Europe. The bull declared a crusade against the Cathars and their supporters, offering the same spiritual rewards that had traditionally been reserved for those who fought to defend the Holy Land against Muslim forces. This was the first time in Christian history that a crusade had been declared against fellow Christians within Europe itself. The implications of this decision extended far beyond the immediate religious conflict. By declaring a crusade against the Cathars, Innocent III was fundamentally altering the nature of religious authority in medieval Europe. No longer would theological disputes be resolved through debate, negotiation, or even local persecution. Instead, the full military might of Christendom could be mobilized against any movement that challenged papal supremacy. The appeal for crusaders found enthusiastic response throughout northern France, where nobles had long envied the wealth and independence of their southern neighbours. The papal bull promised not only spiritual rewards, but material ones as well. Any lord who participated in the crusade would be entitled to claim the lands of heretics and their protectors, effectively offering the conquest of the Languedoc as the price of religious orthodoxy. The response from the Languedoc itself was one of shock and defiance. Raymond VI, faced with the reality that his conflict with Castelnau had escalated beyond all reasonable bounds, attempted to negotiate a peaceful resolution. He offered to do penance for any role he might have played in the legate's death, and to take limited action against the most prominent Cathar leaders in his territories. These offers, which might have satisfied papal demands a year earlier, were now dismissed as insufficient, given the magnitude of the crisis that had been created. As spring turned to summer in 1209, armies began gathering in northern France under the banners of lords, who saw in the Albigensian Crusade an opportunity for both spiritual salvation and material advancement. The peaceful valleys of the Languedoc, where Cathars and Catholics had coexisted for generations, were about to become the battleground for a conflict that would determine not just the fate of a religious movement, but the future character of European Christianity itself. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we've only begun to scratch the surface of this extraordinary story that would reshape medieval Europe forever. Story that would reshape medieval Europe forever. The man chosen to lead this unprecedented crusade against fellow Christians was Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Citeaux, and one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in France. Amalric was no mere scholar or diplomat, but a hardened administrator who had spent decades consolidating Cistercian influence across Europe. His appointment as papal legate and military commander of the crusade signaled that this would be no gentle campaign of persuasion, but a systematic war of extermination. Amalric's approach to the Cathar problem reflected a fundamental shift in Catholic strategy. Where previous legates had attempted to distinguish between heretical leaders and their misguided followers, Amalric viewed the entire population of the Languedoc as contaminated by heretical influence. In his mind, the tolerance that had allowed Catharism to flourish made every noble, merchant, and peasant in the region complicit in rebellion against divine authority. The papal legate's correspondence from this period reveals a man convinced that he was engaged in nothing less than cosmic warfare between the forces of good and evil. He wrote to Pope Innocent III that the Cathars represented not merely doctrinal error, but active service to Satan himself. Their apparent moral purity was, in his view, the most dangerous deception of all, designed to lead innocent souls away from the salvation offered by the true Church. This theological framework justified tactics that would have been unthinkable in conventional medieval warfare. When Amalric addressed the gathering Crusader army at Lyon in June 1209, he made clear that this campaign would follow different rules from those that governed conflicts between Christian princes. The enemy they faced was not merely political, but spiritual, and the contamination of heresy required purification through fire and sword. The Crusader army that assembled under Amalric's command was unlike anything medieval Europe had previously seen deployed against internal enemies. Contemporary chroniclers estimated its size at over 20,000 men, including some of the most powerful nobles of northern France. The Duke of Burgundy, the Count of Nevers, and dozens of lesser lords had answered the papal call, bringing with them professional soldiers, siege engineers, and all the apparatus of medieval warfare. What made this army particularly formidable was not just its size, but its motivation. Unlike typical feudal levies fighting for their lord's political ambitions, these men believed they were engaged in holy war sanctioned by God himself. The promise of plenary indulgence meant that participation in the crusade would wash away all their sins, offering spiritual benefits that no earthly campaign could provide. Combined with the prospect of claiming rich Languedoc territories, this created a powerful incentive for the most ruthless prosecution of the war. The first target chosen by the Crusader leadership was the city of Béziers, a prosperous trading centre that had become known throughout the region for its religious tolerance. The city's population included both Catholics and Cathars living in relative harmony, with intermarriage and business partnerships crossing confessional lines. This peaceful coexistence, which the inhabitants viewed as a mark of their civilization, was precisely what made Béziers so threatening to Crusader ideology. The siege of Béziers began in early July 1209 and immediately revealed the different nature of this conflict. Traditional medieval warfare involved elaborate protocols for the surrender of cities, protection of non-combatants, and preservation of valuable property that could be claimed by victorious armies. Amalric's forces operated under no such constraints, viewing the entire population as legitimate targets for extermination. When the city's leaders attempted to negotiate terms for surrender, they received a response that shocked even experienced military commanders. Amalric demanded that the Catholic population identify and surrender all Cathars within the city walls. When told that Catholics and Cathars had lived together for generations and could not easily be distinguished, the papal legate reportedly replied with words that would echo through history as a symbol of religious fanaticism taken to its logical extreme. The assault on Béziers began at dawn on July 22nd, 1209, with a ferocity that stunned contemporary observers. The Crusader army, inflamed by months of preaching about their holy mission, showed no mercy to defenders or civilians alike. Men, women, and children were cut down indiscriminately as the attackers swept through the streets in what can only be described as an orgy of religiously motivated violence. The massacre that followed the fall of Béziers established patterns that would characterize the entire Albigensian Crusade. Churches that had traditionally served as sanctuaries for non-combatants became slaughterhouses where terrified civilians were burned alive. The Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire, one of the architectural glories of the Languedoc, became a funeral pyre for hundreds of people who had sought refuge within its walls. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of horror that shocked even an age accustomed to violence. Crusader knights, drunk on religious fervour and the promise of divine approval, competed to see who could kill the most heretics. Professional soldiers, normally concerned with preserving valuable captives for ransom, instead focused on total elimination of the enemy population. The very concepts of mercy and discrimination that had traditionally limited medieval warfare were abandoned in favour of what Crusader chroniclers proudly described as purification through holy fire. The destruction of Béziers was methodical as well as brutal. After the killing ended, the Crusader army systematically looted the city of everything valuable before setting it ablaze. Ancient libraries containing centuries of accumulated learning were burned alongside commercial records and private correspondence. Churches were stripped of their sacred vessels and ornaments before being put to the torch. Within days, one of the most prosperous cities in southern France had been reduced to smoking ruins. The psychological impact of the Béziers massacre extended far beyond its immediate military significance. News of the atrocity spread rapidly throughout the Languedoc, carried by refugees who described the unprecedented savagery of the Crusader army. For the first time, the people of southern France understood that this was not a conventional military campaign, but something approaching genocide directed at their entire way of life. The reaction among Cathar communities was one of profound shock mixed with grim determination. The perfect had always taught that the material world was ruled by evil forces, but even they had not anticipated the level of coordinated brutality that the crusade would unleash. Many began preparing their followers for martyrdom, understanding that compromise with such enemies was impossible, and that their only choice lay between apostasy and death. Catholic populations in the Languedoc found themselves in an impossible position. Their religious orthodoxy provided no protection against Crusader armies that viewed all Southerners as contaminated by heretical influence. Nobles who had maintained their Catholic faith while tolerating Cathar subjects discovered that such tolerance was now considered evidence of complicity with heresy. The careful balance that had allowed different religious communities to coexist was shattered permanently. The success at Béziers emboldened the Crusader leadership to accelerate their campaign of conquest. Amalric understood that terror could accomplish what months of siege warfare might not, and he deliberately encouraged the spread of stories about Crusader brutality. The message was clear: cities that resisted would face the same fate as Béziers, while those that surrendered immediately might hope for more merciful treatment. This strategy of calculated terror proved remarkably effective in the short term. Town after town opened its gates to the approaching Crusader army, rather than risk the fate that had befallen Béziers. Local nobles found their authority collapsing as their subjects fled, rather than face the prospect of holy war. The careful political structure that had sustained the independence of the Languedoc began to crumble under the weight of unprecedented external pressure. Yet even as military resistance collapsed, the underlying religious and cultural differences that had sparked the conflict remained unresolved. The Crusader army could occupy cities and castles, but it could not easily change the hearts and minds of a population that had embraced religious diversity as a mark of their sophistication. The stage was being set for a protracted struggle that would consume the region for decades to come. Here at obscure Historiesa, we're witnessing the transformation of a religious dispute into something approaching modern total war. The fall of Béziers marked not just a military victory, but the beginning of a systematic campaign to reshape the entire cultural landscape of southern France. The Crusader army now turned its attention to an even greater prize: the ancient city of Carcassonne, whose massive fortifications and strategic location made it the key to controlling the entire region. What happened there would determine whether the Cathar movement could mount any effective resistance to the forces arrayed against it. The march from the smoking ruins of Béziers to the walls of Carcassonne took the Crusader army through some of the most beautiful countryside in France. The rolling hills covered with vineyards, the prosperous villages nestled in fertile valleys, and the ancient Roman roads that connected thriving market towns all testified to the wealth and civilization that the Languedoc had achieved under its tolerant rulers. This prosperity, built over generations of peaceful coexistence between different religious communities, now faced systematic destruction at the hands of men who viewed diversity itself as an offense against divine order. Carcassonne represented everything that made the Languedoc distinctive in medieval Europe. The city's massive double walls, built by Roman engineers and strengthened by generations of local rulers, enclosed a cosmopolitan population that included not just Catholics and Cathars, but Jewish merchants, Muslim craftsmen, and scholars from across the Mediterranean world. The court of Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel had become famous throughout Europe for its patronage of troubadour poetry, its support for learning, and its remarkable religious tolerance. The 24-year-old Trencavel faced an impossible situation as the Crusader army approached his capital. Unlike Raymond VI of Toulouse, who could potentially negotiate with church authorities by abandoning his Cathar subjects, the young Viscount had built his entire political identity around protecting the religious diversity that characterized his domains. His family had intermarried with Cathar nobles, his court included prominent Cathar perfect as advisors, and his subjects expected him to defend the tolerant traditions that had made Carcassonne prosperous. The Viscount's military position was stronger than that of most Languedoc nobles. Carcassonne's fortifications were among the most formidable in Europe, provisioned for a lengthy siege and defended by experienced soldiers who understood that surrender would likely mean death or exile. The surrounding countryside remained loyal to Trencavel, providing intelligence about Crusader movements and potential bases for guerrilla warfare should the siege prove unsuccessful. Yet Trencavel also understood the broader strategic situation better than many of his contemporaries. The Crusader army was not merely another feudal host seeking temporary advantage, but the advance guard of a systematic campaign supported by the full resources of the Catholic Church and the French monarchy. Even if Carcassonne successfully withstood siege, other Crusader armies would follow until the entire region was subjugated or depopulated. The siege of Carcassonne began in August 1209, with elaborate ceremonies designed to emphasize the religious nature of the conflict. Amalric celebrated Mass before the assembled Crusader army, blessing their weapons and promising divine assistance in the coming battle. Banners bearing the papal arms flew alongside the heraldic devices of great French nobles, symbolizing the alliance between spiritual and temporal authority that made this crusade possible. The Crusader leadership's approach to Carcassonne differed significantly from their treatment of Béziers. Where the earlier city had been seen primarily as an example to terrorize other communities, Carcassonne represented a strategic prize whose capture would effectively end organized resistance throughout the region. This required more sophisticated tactics than simple massacre, though the underlying goal remained the same: complete elimination of Cathar influence and the cultural traditions that had sustained it. Amalric's first move was to attempt the same strategy that had proven successful elsewhere, offering terms for surrender that would spare the city in exchange for the immediate expulsion of all Cathars and their supporters. When Trencavel's envoys arrived at the Crusader camp to hear these demands, they encountered conditions that made clear the true nature of what was being offered. The Crusaders would spare the lives of Catholic inhabitants, but all property belonging to heretics or their sympathizers would be confiscated. All noble families suspected of Cathar connections would be exiled, and the entire political structure of the region would be reorganized under northern French leadership. These terms amounted to the complete destruction of Languedoc civilization, replacing its distinctive culture with the more rigid orthodoxy of northern France. Trencavel's rejection of such demands was inevitable, but his response revealed the deeper principles at stake in the conflict. He would not abandon subjects who had shown him loyalty simply to purchase his own survival. The traditions of his ancestors and the honor of his house demanded resistance regardless of the consequences. The actual siege operations that followed demonstrated the technological sophistication that the Crusader army brought to its campaign of religious conquest. Northern French engineers constructed massive siege engines, dug elaborate tunnel systems, and employed the latest military innovations developed during decades of crusading in the Holy Land. This was not a haphazard feudal raid, but a professional military operation designed to achieve decisive strategic results. The defenders of Carcassonne proved equally sophisticated in their response. The city's walls had been designed by some of the best military architects in Europe, incorporating lessons learned from centuries of warfare. The garrison included not just local knights but professional soldiers from across the Languedoc, who understood that the fall of Carcassonne would doom resistance throughout the region. Their defense was correspondingly desperate and determined. As the siege dragged on through the sweltering heat of August, both armies began to suffer from the conditions that made medieval warfare so brutal even for its participants. The Crusader camp, swollen with camp followers and pilgrims seeking indulgences, became a breeding ground for disease and disorder. Supply lines stretched across hostile territory faced constant harassment from local populations who remained loyal to their traditional rulers. The promise of easy conquest that had motivated many participants began to seem increasingly hollow, yet the defenders faced even greater challenges as the siege tightened around them. The massive population that had sought refuge within Carcassonne's walls quickly exhausted the city's water supplies, creating conditions that favored the spread of epidemic disease. Food shortages became acute as the Crusader army's control of the surrounding countryside prevented any resupply efforts. Most critically, the defenders could expect no relief from external forces, as other Languedoc nobles lacked the strength to challenge the Crusader army directly. The deteriorating conditions within Carcassonne created the perfect opportunity for the Crusader leadership to exploit divisions within the defending forces. Amalric understood that prolonged sieges often succeeded not through direct assault, but by encouraging betrayal from within the besieged community. The papal legate began sending secret envoys to prominent Catholic nobles within the city, offering generous terms for defection and threatening severe punishment for continued resistance. These psychological warfare tactics proved remarkably effective against defenders who had never faced such systematic pressure. Unlike conventional medieval conflicts where sieges ended in negotiated settlements that preserved existing social hierarchies, the Albigensian Crusade offered no such compromises. Catholic nobles within Carcassonne found themselves forced to choose between loyalty to their traditional lord and survival within the new religious order that the Crusaders represented. The breaking point came not through military defeat, but through the collapse of civilian morale within the city. As water supplies dwindled and disease spread through the overcrowded streets, the population began demanding that Trencavel negotiate terms for surrender. The young Viscount faced the agonizing choice between prolonging resistance that might preserve his honor while ensuring the destruction of his people, or accepting defeat that would save lives while ending centuries of Languedoc independence. The final negotiations between Trencavel and the Crusader leadership revealed the true scope of what was being demanded. Amalric's terms had evolved during the siege to encompass not just the surrender of Cathar communities, but the complete reorganization of southern French society according to northern French and papal preferences. The Viscount would be permitted to leave Carcassonne with a small retinue, but his lands would be redistributed to Crusader nobles who had demonstrated proper religious orthodoxy. Trencavel's acceptance of these terms in August 1209 marked a watershed moment in the Albigensian Crusade. For the first time, a major Languedoc noble had been forced to abandon his traditional domains entirely, setting a precedent that would reshape the entire political structure of the region. The young Viscount's tragic fate, he died in Crusader custody shortly after the surrender, possibly poisoned, became a symbol of what awaited any southern noble who resisted the new order. The fall of Carcassonne had immediate strategic consequences that extended far beyond the city itself. With the strongest fortress in the region now under Crusader control, organized military resistance throughout the Languedoc became virtually impossible. Town after town sent envoys to the Crusader camp offering submission rather than face siege warfare they could not hope to win. The careful balance of power that had sustained regional independence collapsed within weeks. Yet the Crusader leadership understood that military conquest was only the first step in their larger project of religious and cultural transformation. Occupying territory was meaningless unless the population could be compelled to abandon the beliefs and practices that had made Catharism possible in the first place. This required not just soldiers, but administrators, lawyers, and clergy who could implement the systematic changes necessary to create lasting orthodoxy. The man chosen to oversee this transformation was Simon de Montfort, a minor northern French noble who had distinguished himself during the siege of Carcassonne through his combination of military skill and religious fanaticism. De Montfort's appointment as leader of the Crusader army and ruler of conquered territories marked a new phase in the conflict, one that would prove even more devastating to Languedoc society than the initial military campaigns. De Montfort brought to his new position a clear vision of what the conquered territories should become. In his mind, the tolerance that had characterized the old Languedoc was not merely misguided, but actively evil, creating conditions that allowed heretical movements to flourish. His goal was nothing less than the complete replacement of southern French culture with the more rigid orthodoxy that he believed represented true Christian civilization. The new ruler's first priority was establishing administrative systems that would prevent any resurgence of Cathar influence. This meant replacing not just obvious heretics, but anyone whose loyalty to the new order remained questionable. Local judges, tax collectors, guild leaders, and even parish priests found themselves subject to investigation by commissioners appointed from northern France. Those who could not demonstrate acceptable religious credentials faced exile, imprisonment, or worse. These administrative changes had profound effects on daily life throughout the conquered territories. Commercial relationships that had existed for generations were severed when merchants were classified as heretical sympathizers. Craft guilds that had maintained their own religious traditions found themselves disbanded and reorganized under strict Catholic supervision. Even family relationships became subject to scrutiny, as marriage alliances with suspected Cathar families became evidence of religious contamination. The economic consequences of these policies proved as devastating as their religious implications. The Languedoc's prosperity had been built on trade networks that connected the region to markets throughout the Mediterranean world. These networks depended on trust relationships between merchants of different religious backgrounds, Jewish financiers, Muslim craftsmen, and Christian traders who had learned to work together despite their theological differences. The Crusader insistence on religious conformity shattered these relationships permanently. De Montfort's military campaigns during this period focused not on conventional conquest, but on what modern observers would recognize as counter-insurgency warfare. Small Cathar communities that had survived the initial Crusader advance found themselves hunted systematically by mobile forces that showed no mercy to civilians. Villages suspected of harboring perfect were burned entirely, their populations scattered or killed as examples to potential sympathizers. The resistance that emerged in response to these tactics differed fundamentally from the conventional feudal warfare that had characterized the initial Crusader victories. Unable to defend fixed positions against overwhelming Crusader strength, Cathar sympathizers and displaced nobles turned to guerrilla tactics that exploited their knowledge of local terrain and continued popular support. These irregular forces could not hope to defeat the Crusader army in open battle, but they could make the occupation increasingly costly and precarious. The guerrilla warfare that developed during this period created a cycle of violence and repression that poisoned relationships between different communities throughout the region. Crusader forces, frustrated by their inability to distinguish between active resistance and passive sympathy, increasingly treated all Southerners as potential enemies. Local populations, subjected to arbitrary searches, confiscations, and executions, found their initial neutrality hardening into active opposition. The role of women in both resistance and persecution during this phase of the conflict revealed the deeper social transformations that the Crusade was attempting to impose. Cathar communities had traditionally accorded women significant religious authority, with female perfect enjoying respect and influence that was unprecedented in medieval Christian society. The Crusader campaign specifically targeted these women as symbols of the heretical inversion of proper social order. The systematic persecution of female perfect proved particularly brutal even by the standards of the Albigensian Crusade. These women, many of them from aristocratic families, had voluntarily embraced lives of poverty and service that earned them widespread respect within their communities. Their execution by burning was designed not merely to eliminate individual heretics, but to demonstrate the consequences of challenging traditional gender hierarchies that the Crusaders sought to restore. The propaganda war that accompanied these military and administrative campaigns revealed the sophisticated understanding that both sides had developed of public opinion and its importance to long-term success. Crusader chroniclers produced elaborate accounts of their victories that emphasized divine approval for their cause, while portraying all resistance as inspired by demonic forces. These narratives, distributed throughout northern France and beyond, helped maintain support for what was becoming an increasingly expensive and protracted campaign. Cathar and Languedoc resistance produced their own competing narratives that emphasized the injustice of the Crusader cause and the moral superiority of their traditional way of life. These accounts, preserved in Occitan poetry and prose, painted the Crusaders as foreign invaders, whose religious rhetoric masked simple greed for southern wealth and territory. The troubadour tradition that had flourished under the old regime now became a vehicle for resistance literature that kept alive memories of the lost Golden Age. By 1212, 3 years after the fall of Béziers, the Albigensian Crusade had achieved most of its immediate military objectives, while failing completely in its larger goal of eliminating Cathar influence. The great fortresses of the Languedoc lay in Crusader hands. The traditional noble families had been killed, exiled, or reduced to impotence, and new administrative systems had been imposed throughout the conquered territories. Yet Catharism itself proved remarkably resilient, adapting to persecution by becoming more secretive and decentralized rather than simply disappearing. The failure to achieve decisive religious victory despite overwhelming military success forced the Crusader leadership to confront the limitations of violence as a tool for changing deeply held beliefs. The people of the Languedoc had not embraced Catharism merely as a fashion or political convenience, but as a genuine religious conviction that addressed their spiritual needs better than Orthodox Catholicism. Eliminating such beliefs required more than military conquest. It demanded institutional changes that could provide alternative sources of meaning and community. This realization led to the next phase of the anti-Cathar campaign, one that would prove far more effective than pure military force. The establishment of the medieval Inquisition represented a new approach to the heresy problem, one that combined legal sophistication with psychological manipulation to achieve the systematic transformation of belief that armies alone could not accomplish. Here at obscure Historiesa, we're witnessing the birth of institutions that would reshape not just the religious landscape of Europe, but the very nature of how authority operates within Christian civilization. The evolution of anti-Cathar strategy from military conquest to systematic investigation marked a crucial turning point in medieval European history. The men who would design and implement the Inquisition understood that heretical beliefs could not be destroyed through external force alone, but required the creation of institutional mechanisms capable of penetrating the most intimate aspects of human consciousness. The intellectual architect of this new approach was a Spanish priest named Dominic de Guzman, who had observed the failure of conventional preaching methods during his early encounters with Cathar communities. Unlike his contemporaries who attributed heretical success to ignorance or demonic deception, Dominic recognized that Catharism appealed to sophisticated believers who had made informed choices about their spiritual lives. Defeating such a movement required equally sophisticated counter-strategies. Dominic's revolutionary insight was that effective anti-heretical work required dedicated specialists who could match the Cathar perfect in learning, dedication, and apparent sanctity. The Dominican order that he founded represented a new type of religious community specifically designed for theological warfare. These preaching friars would combine the scholarly training of university theologians with the ascetic lifestyle that had made Cathar perfect, so impressive to ordinary believers. The early Dominican missions to the Languedoc revealed both the potential and the limitations of this new approach. Dominican friars proved far more effective than traditional clergy in theological debates with Cathar perfect, demonstrating superior knowledge of scripture and patristic tradition. Their voluntary poverty and personal austerity undermined Cathar arguments about Catholic corruption and worldliness. Most importantly, their obvious intelligence and education made it impossible to dismiss their arguments as the product of ignorance or blind faith. Yet even these improved preaching methods achieved limited success in converting committed Cathars or their sympathizers. The problem, as Dominican observers noted, was not that Cathar arguments were intellectually superior, but that Cathar communities provided social and psychological benefits that mere theological correctness could not match. People remained loyal to movements that had given meaning to their lives, supported them during difficulties, and connected them to communities of like-minded believers. The solution that emerged from this analysis would fundamentally alter the relationship between religious authority and individual conscience in medieval Europe. If heretical communities could not be defeated through intellectual argument alone, then the social structures that sustained them had to be systematically destroyed. This required legal mechanisms that could penetrate private relationships, investigate secret beliefs, and impose consequences severe enough to discourage heretical sympathies. The formal establishment of the medieval Inquisition in 1233 represented the culmination of decades of experimentation with different approaches to the heresy problem. Pope Gregory, the Ninth's bull commissioning Dominican friars as papal inquisitors, created an institution unlike anything that had previously existed in Christian history. These men would possess extraordinary powers to investigate, judge, and punish heretical beliefs while operating outside the normal constraints of medieval legal procedure. The genius of the inquisitorial system lay not in its use of torture or dramatic executions, though these certainly occurred, but in its systematic approach to identifying and isolating heretical networks. Inquisitors understood that religious movements like Catharism depended on complex webs of family relationships, business partnerships, and social connections that sustained belief, even when official religious leadership was eliminated. Breaking these networks required detailed knowledge of community relationships and careful application of pressure at strategic points. The procedures developed by early inquisitors reflected sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Rather than simply demanding public confessions of heretical beliefs, inquisitors created systems of interrogation designed to reveal the full extent of heretical networks. Suspects were encouraged to confess not only their own involvement, but to identify others who had participated in heretical activities. Those who cooperated fully received relatively lenient punishments, while those who remained silent faced increasingly severe consequences. This approach proved devastatingly effective against communities that had been accustomed to religious tolerance and mutual protection. The prospect of lengthy imprisonment, confiscation of property, or execution created powerful incentives for betrayal that gradually destroyed the trust relationships on which Cathar communities depended. former friends and neighbours found themselves forced to choose between personal survival and loyalty to their religious community. The psychological warfare employed by inquisitors extended far beyond their formal legal proceedings. The very existence of the Inquisition created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made normal social relationships increasingly difficult for anyone suspected of heretical sympathies. Business partnerships became dangerous when they might be interpreted as evidence of religious complicity. Marriage alliances required careful investigation of both families' religious histories. Even casual conversations carried risks if they touched on theological topics that might be reported to inquisitorial authorities. The impact of these tactics on Languedoc society was profound and lasting. The culture of intellectual curiosity and religious experimentation that had made the region distinctive gradually gave way to cautious conformity. Troubadour poetry, once celebrated for its sophisticated treatment of love and spirituality, increasingly focused on safer themes that could not be interpreted as heretical. Scholarly debate, formerly encouraged in the courts of tolerant nobles, became dangerous when it might question orthodox religious teachings. The effectiveness of inquisitorial methods varied considerably depending on local conditions and the skill of individual inquisitors. In areas where Cathar communities had deep roots and continued popular support, investigations often proved frustratingly inconclusive. Witnesses refused to cooperate, suspects disappeared before they could be arrested, and local officials sometimes proved reluctant to assist in prosecutions that targeted respected community members. Yet even partial success in breaking up heretical networks had cumulative effects that gradually weakened the entire movement. Each confession provided information that could be used to identify other suspects, creating expanding circles of investigation that eventually touched most families with any history of Cathar involvement. The constant threat of denunciation made it increasingly difficult for perfect to travel safely or maintain the regular contact with believers that their religious system required. The adaptation strategies developed by surviving Cathar communities during this period revealed both their resilience and their ultimate vulnerability to systematic persecution. Perfect learned to operate in smaller groups, maintain more secretive communication methods, and rely on increasingly trusted circles of supporters. These adaptations allowed the movement to survive for several more decades, but they also transformed its character in ways that made it less attractive to potential converts. The secretive, fearful communities that emerged from decades of persecution bore little resemblance to the confident, open religious movement that had once attracted hundreds of thousands of followers across southern France. The transformation of Catharism from a public alternative to Catholic Christianity into an underground resistance movement marked the beginning of its inevitable decline toward complete extinction. Here at obscure Historiesa, we're witnessing the development of techniques for controlling religious belief that would influence European society for centuries to come. The methods pioneered by anti-Cathar inquisitors established precedents for religious persecution that would be applied against Jews, Muslims, Protestants, and countless other groups who challenged orthodox authority. The systematic destruction of the Cathars was becoming a template for the elimination of religious diversity throughout medieval Europe. The transformation of Catharism from a thriving religious movement into a desperate underground resistance revealed the devastating effectiveness of the inquisitorial system, but it also demonstrated the extraordinary courage of those who refused to abandon their beliefs despite facing certain death. As the 13th century progressed, the surviving Cathar communities found themselves caught between the relentless pressure of systematic persecution and their own theological conviction that martyrdom was preferable to apostasy. The perfect who remained active during this period operated under conditions that would have broken lesser spirits. They travelled by night through familiar countryside that had become hostile territory, relying on networks of supporters who risked their own lives by providing shelter and sustenance. These brave men and women understood that every day of freedom might be their last, yet they continued their sacred mission of providing spiritual guidance to believers who had nowhere else to turn for religious comfort. The courage required for such dedication becomes even more remarkable when we consider the fate that awaited captured perfect. The inquisitorial records from this period document execution after execution, each one carefully designed to serve as both punishment and warning to potential sympathizers. These men and women faced their deaths with a serenity that impressed even their executioners, singing hymns as the flames consumed them and refusing final opportunities to save themselves through public recantation of their beliefs. The impact of these martyrdoms on surviving Cathar communities was complex and contradictory. On one hand, the steadfast faith of the perfect in the face of death provided powerful testimony to the truth of their teachings and inspired continued resistance among their followers. Stories of miraculous signs accompanying executions spread throughout the region, reinforcing belief that the perfect were indeed holy people who had achieved spiritual perfection despite the condemnation of earthly authorities. Yet the systematic elimination of religious leadership also created practical problems that gradually undermined the movement's ability to sustain itself. The consolamentum could only be administered by perfect who had themselves received the sacrament through proper apostolic succession. As more and more perfect were captured and executed, the pool of qualified religious leaders shrank dramatically, making it increasingly difficult for ordinary believers to receive the spiritual initiation that their faith required. The theological implications of this crisis forced surviving Cathar communities to confront fundamental questions about the nature of their religious system. If God truly supported their cause, why did divine intervention not protect the perfect from their persecutors? If the material world was indeed controlled by evil forces, why struggle to maintain earthly religious institutions when spiritual salvation could be achieved through individual faith alone? Different Cathar communities responded to these challenges in different ways, creating theological diversity within a movement that had once maintained relatively unified doctrinal positions. Some groups embraced an even more radical rejection of the material world, arguing that the persecution they faced proved the complete corruption of earthly existence and the futility of attempting to maintain religious institutions within Satan's realm. Others developed modified theological positions that allowed for greater flexibility in religious practice, while maintaining core Cathar beliefs about the dualistic nature of reality. The most significant theological development during this period was the emergence of what historians call popular Catharism, a simplified version of the faith that could be practiced by ordinary believers without requiring access to perfect or elaborate religious ceremonies. This adaptation allowed Cathar beliefs to survive in isolated communities long after the formal religious hierarchy had been destroyed, but it also represented a fundamental transformation of the movement's character. The folk religion that emerged from this process bore obvious similarities to traditional Cathar teachings, but lacked the sophisticated theological framework that had once distinguished the movement from conventional Christian heresy. Stories of the two gods became simplified folk tales passed down through oral tradition. Complex theological arguments about the nature of matter and spirit were reduced to basic moral teachings about the corruption of worldly authorities and the superior virtue of simple living. These changes allowed modified versions of Cathar belief to persist in remote mountain communities well into the 14th century. But they also marked the effective end of Catharism as a coherent religious alternative to Catholic Christianity. The movement had been successfully transformed from an organized challenge to orthodox authority into scattered fragments of folk belief that posed no serious threat to established religious institutions. The final act in the destruction of organized Catharism played out in the remote fortress of Montségur, perched on a rocky outcrop in the Pyrenees Mountains that had served as a refuge for perfect and their most devoted followers. This isolated stronghold had become the last major centre of Cathar religious authority, housing a community of perfect who continued to perform the sacred rituals that kept their faith alive despite decades of persecution. The siege of Montségur began in May 1243 and would last for nearly a year, becoming the longest and most symbolic confrontation of the entire anti-Cathar campaign. The fortress itself was virtually impregnable to direct assault, built on a mountain peak that could only be approached through narrow paths easily defended by a handful of determined soldiers. The small garrison included both professional warriors and perfect who had chosen to make their final stand in this remote sanctuary. The besieging forces, led by Seneschal Hugh des Arcis, understood that Montségur represented far more than a military objective. This was the spiritual heart of the remaining Cathar movement, and its fall would symbolize the complete victory of Orthodox Christianity over heretical rebellion. The siege therefore became a matter of prestige for both sides, with neither willing to accept anything less than total victory or total defeat. The conditions within Montségur during the long siege tested the faith and endurance of defenders who had already endured decades of persecution. Food supplies dwindled as winter approached, forcing the community to survive on increasingly meager rations. The constant threat of assault made normal life impossible, with everyone from perfect to children forced to contribute to defensive preparations. Yet contemporary accounts describe a community that maintained remarkable spiritual discipline even under these extreme conditions. The perfect continued their religious duties, providing guidance and comfort to believers who looked to them for leadership in what everyone understood might be their final months of life. Religious ceremonies took place regularly despite the danger, with the community gathering for prayer and instruction, even as enemy siege engines hurled stones at their walls. The defenders' determination to maintain their religious practices in the face of almost certain death provides powerful testimony to the depth of their conviction. These were not fanatics driven by blind hatred, but thoughtful people who had chosen their spiritual path after careful consideration and remained committed to it despite understanding the consequences. Their courage in the face of overwhelming odds earned the respect even of their enemies, who recognized the extraordinary dedication that sustained such resistance. The military situation gradually became hopeless as the siege dragged through the winter months of 1243 to 1244. The attackers succeeded in establishing positions that made resupply impossible, while their superior numbers allowed them to maintain constant pressure on the defenders. Disease and malnutrition weakened the garrison's ability to man the walls effectively, making successful assault increasingly likely with each passing week. The final negotiations between the defenders and their besiegers revealed the tragic futility of the entire conflict. Hugh des Arcis offered terms that would spare the lives of soldiers and ordinary believers who agreed to confess their errors and submit to church authority. The perfect, however, would receive no mercy, as their status as religious leaders made them too dangerous to be allowed to live even in captivity. The response of the Montségur, perfect to these terms, demonstrated the theological principles that had sustained their movement throughout decades of persecution. They refused to purchase their lives through religious compromise, arguing that apostasy would damn their souls even if it preserved their bodies. Their commitment to spiritual integrity, regardless of temporal consequences, embodied the very essence of Cathar, teaching about the supremacy of spiritual over material considerations. On March 2nd, 1244, the defenders of Montségur formally surrendered after nearly 10 months of siege. The terms allowed a 2-week truce, during which soldiers and ordinary believers could decide whether to accept church mercy or share the fate of the perfect. Contemporary chroniclers record that more than 200 people, including some who could have saved themselves through confession, chose martyrdom rather than abandonment of their faith. The mass execution that followed the surrender of Montségur became the most famous single event in the long history of anti-Cathar persecution. A massive pyre was constructed at the foot of the mountain, and on March 16th, 1244, more than 200 perfect and their supporters walked voluntarily into the flames rather than renounce their beliefs. Witnesses described an event that combined horror and inspiration in equal measure, as men and women of all ages faced death with a serenity that impressed even their executioners. The psychological impact of the Montségur martyrdoms extended far beyond their immediate religious significance. For surviving Cathar sympathizers throughout the region, the image of perfect walking willingly into the flames became a powerful symbol of spiritual victory achieved through apparent earthly defeat. Stories of miraculous phenomena accompanying the executions spread throughout southern France, reinforcing belief that the victims had achieved the spiritual perfection that their religious name claimed. Yet the fall of Montségur also marked the effective end of organized Cathar resistance to Orthodox authority. With the destruction of their last major stronghold and the elimination of most remaining religious leadership, the movement could no longer function as a coherent alternative to Catholic Christianity. Individual believers might maintain their faith in secret, but the institutional structures that had once sustained vibrant religious communities had been permanently destroyed. The transformation of the Montségur story into legend began almost immediately after the executions took place. Troubadour poets, many of them exiles from the destroyed Languedoc culture, created elaborate narratives that portrayed the martyrs as heroes whose sacrifice would eventually be vindicated through divine justice. These literary works helped preserve memory of the Cathar movement long after its physical destruction, ensuring that the story of the perfect would continue to inspire later generations of religious dissidents. The systematic documentation of Cathar elimination by inquisitorial authorities provides modern historians with unprecedented insight into how a religious movement can be completely destroyed through coordinated persecution. The records show that success required not just military conquest, but the patient work of identifying and breaking up the social networks that sustained heretical communities. The combination of legal pressure, economic sanctions, and social ostracism proved far more effective than simple violence in achieving the long-term goal of religious uniformity. The techniques developed during the anti-Cathar campaign established precedents that would be applied against numerous other groups throughout medieval and early modern European history. The institutional mechanisms created to identify and eliminate heretical beliefs became permanent features of Catholic administration, evolving into the Spanish Inquisition and other instruments of religious control that would shape European society for centuries to come. The economic consequences of the Cathar elimination extended far beyond the immediate religious sphere, fundamentally altering the social and commercial structures that had made the Languedoc distinctive within medieval Europe. The confiscation of property belonging to heretics and their sympathizers transferred enormous wealth from local families to northern French nobles and church institutions, effectively completing the political conquest that military force had begun. The cultural transformation was equally profound, as the tolerant, intellectually curious society that had sustained Catharism was replaced by the more rigid orthodoxy favoured by the victorious authorities. The troubadour tradition that had flourished under the old regime gradually disappeared, taking with it a unique form of literary expression that had influenced cultural development throughout medieval Europe. The disappearance of Jewish and Muslim communities that had thrived under Cathar protection demonstrated the broader implications of religious uniformity for medieval society. These groups had contributed significantly to the economic prosperity and intellectual vitality of the Languedoc, but their presence was incompatible with the new order's insistence on complete Catholic conformity. Their elimination impoverished the region in ways that extended far beyond mere religious considerations. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we're witnessing the completion of one of medieval Europe's most systematic campaigns of cultural destruction. The elimination of the Cathars represented not just the defeat of a particular religious movement, but the triumph of institutional authority over individual spiritual conscience. The methods used to achieve this victory would echo through European history, establishing patterns of persecution that would be applied against countless other groups who dared to challenge orthodox authority. The legacy of the Cathar destruction extends into our modern world in ways that few people recognize. The techniques of systematic persecution, the use of legal mechanisms to control belief, and the transformation of religious diversity into dangerous heresy all established precedents that continue to influence how societies deal with dissent and difference. The story of the Cathars serves as both historical tragedy and contemporary warning about the fragility of tolerance and the ease with which fear can be weaponized against minority communities. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Cathars lies not in their destruction, but in their example of principled resistance to overwhelming authority. The perfect who walked into the flames at Montségur, the believers who maintained their faith despite decades of persecution, and the communities that chose spiritual integrity over temporal survival all demonstrated that human conscience can transcend even the most sophisticated systems of control. Their story reminds us that while institutional power may triumph in the short term, the principles for which people are willing to die possess a permanence that outlasts their persecutors. The final scattered communities of Cathar believers who survived into the 14th century faced challenges that differed significantly from those that had confronted their predecessors. By this time, the systematic persecution had been so successful that maintaining any form of organized religious practice had become virtually impossible. The last perfect operated in complete secrecy, administering the consolamentum only to trusted individuals and avoiding any activities that might attract inquisitorial attention. These final decades of Cathar existence were characterized by a gradual transformation of the movement from organized religion into folk memory. Stories of the perfect and their teachings became part of local oral tradition, passed down through families that maintained emotional connections to the destroyed religious community while avoiding any practices that might identify them as active heretics. This process of cultural preservation through memory would ensure that knowledge of Catharism survived long after its formal elimination. The last documented Cathar perfect, Guillaume Bellibaste, was captured and executed in 1321, marking what historians consider the end of the movement as a living religious tradition. His death closed a chapter that had begun more than 2 centuries earlier with the first appearance of Cathar communities in the Languedoc. The transformation of a vibrant religious movement into historical memory was finally complete. Yet even as organized Catharism disappeared, its influence on European religious and intellectual development continued in subtle ways that scholars are still discovering. The questions that Cathar theologians had raised about the nature of evil, the relationship between spirit and matter, and the authority of religious institutions would resurface in later medieval and Renaissance thought. The example of their systematic persecution would influence Protestant reformers who faced similar challenges from Catholic authorities. The memory of their principled resistance would inspire later generations of religious dissidents who drew strength from their example. The rediscovery of Cathar history in the modern era has revealed the extent to which their story had been deliberately obscured by the very authorities who destroyed them. Medieval chroniclers, writing under church patronage, portrayed the Cathars as dangerous heretics, whose elimination was necessary for the preservation of Christian civilization. Only through careful analysis of inquisitorial records, archaeological evidence, and surviving fragments of Cathar literature have modern historians been able to reconstruct a more balanced picture of who these people actually were and what they represented. This historical recovery has transformed our understanding not just of the Cathars themselves, but of the entire medieval period in which they lived. Their story reveals a medieval Europe far more diverse and intellectually sophisticated than traditional narratives suggested, while their destruction demonstrates the lengths to which institutional authorities would go to maintain religious uniformity. The Cathar experience thus serves as a window into both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval European civilization. The rediscovery of Cathar manuscripts in hidden caches throughout southern France during the 19th and 20th centuries provided scholars with unprecedented access to the actual beliefs and practices of the movement, as opposed to the distorted accounts produced by their enemies. These documents, carefully concealed in cave systems and monastery walls, by believers who hoped future generations might understand their true nature, revealed a religious tradition far more sophisticated and humane than inquisitorial records had suggested. The theological texts that survived this centuries-long concealment demonstrate the intellectual rigor that characterized Cathar religious thought. Rather than the simple dualistic mythology described by Catholic critics, these manuscripts reveal complex philosophical discussions about the nature of reality, detailed commentaries on biblical texts, and sophisticated arguments about moral responsibility in a world divided between competing divine forces. The quality of scholarship evident in these works compares favorably with the best academic theology produced in medieval universities. Perhaps most significantly, the recovered Cathar literature provides insight into the daily spiritual practices that sustained their communities through decades of persecution. Prayer books written in Occitan preserve the actual words that Perfect recited during religious ceremonies, revealing a tradition of contemplative spirituality that emphasized personal transformation through direct spiritual experience. These texts show how Cathar believers understood their relationship to the divine cosmos and how they prepared themselves for the ultimate spiritual journey that death represented. The ritual manuals that survived the systematic destruction of Cathar libraries illuminate the practical aspects of their religious life that had been completely misrepresented by hostile sources. The consolamentum, rather than being a simple deathbed ceremony, as Catholic chroniclers suggested, emerges from these documents as an elaborate spiritual initiation that required years of preparation and demonstrated profound theological understanding. The complexity of these rituals reveals a religious tradition with deep historical roots and sophisticated institutional development. The correspondence between Cathar communities across different regions shows how effectively they maintained communication networks despite constant surveillance by hostile authorities. Letters written in coded language allowed Perfect to coordinate their activities, share theological insights, and provide mutual support during the darkest periods of persecution. These communications reveal a movement that remained intellectually vibrant and organizationally coherent, even as it faced systematic elimination. The economic records that survived from Cathar communities challenge many assumptions about medieval religious movements and their relationship to worldly concerns. Rather than rejecting all involvement with material affairs, as their theological emphasis on spiritual purity might suggest, Cathar communities developed sophisticated systems for managing property, supporting their members, and contributing to the welfare of broader society. These documents show how they balance their theological conviction about the corrupted nature of the material world with practical necessity for engaging with economic realities. The educational materials preserved in Cathar archives demonstrate their commitment to intellectual development and their recognition that sustained religious commitment required thorough understanding of theological principles. Schools operated by Cathar communities provided instruction not only in religious doctrine, but in practical skills, classical languages, and natural philosophy. The curriculum that emerges from surviving documents reveals educational standards that rivaled those of established monasteries and cathedral schools. The medical texts that formed part of Cathar libraries reflect their reputation as healers and their understanding of the connection between spiritual and physical well-being. These manuscripts combine practical medical knowledge drawn from classical sources with theological insights about the relationship between spiritual purity and bodily health. The integration of medical practice with religious ministry helped explain why Cathar Perfect were so valued by the communities they served, even among those who did not share their theological convictions. The historical chronicles produced within Cathar communities provide alternative perspectives on the events that led to their destruction, offering viewpoints that differ dramatically from the official accounts produced by their persecutors. These narratives emphasize the prosperity and cultural vitality that characterized the Languedoc before the Crusade, the arbitrary nature of the violence unleashed against peaceful communities, and the heroic resistance of individuals who chose spiritual integrity over temporal survival. The legal documents preserved in Cathar archives reveal how thoroughly integrated they had become within the social and economic structures of medieval Languedoc society. Contracts, property transfers, and commercial agreements show Cathar believers and perfect participating fully in the economic life of their communities while maintaining their distinctive religious identity. These records demonstrate that the portrait of Cathars as withdrawn sectarians was largely a creation of hostile propaganda designed to justify their persecution. The artistic and literary works produced within Cathar communities challenge assumptions about medieval religious art and its relationship to theological doctrine. Rather than rejecting all forms of artistic expression as distractions from spiritual contemplation, Cathar patrons supported sophisticated cultural production that expressed their religious values through beauty and intellectual refinement. The manuscripts they commissioned featured elaborate illuminations, and their courts patronized troubadour poetry that achieved the highest artistic standards of the medieval period. The scientific texts that formed part of Cathar intellectual culture reveal their engagement with the broader learned tradition of medieval Europe and their contributions to the advancement of knowledge. Cathar scholars produced works on astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy that demonstrated their commitment to understanding the created world despite their theological conviction about its corrupted nature. These texts show how religious conviction could coexist with intellectual curiosity and scientific investigation. The diplomatic correspondence between Cathar leaders and foreign rulers provides evidence of the international connections that sustained their movement and the broader European recognition of their legitimacy as religious authorities. Letters exchanged with Byzantine churchmen, negotiations with German princes, and communications with Italian city-states all demonstrate that Catharism was recognized as a legitimate religious tradition by significant elements of medieval European society. The financial records that survived from major Cathar centers reveal the substantial resources that the movement commanded at the height of its influence and the systematic way in which these resources were deployed to support religious activities and charitable works. Account books from communities like Montségur show careful management of donations, agricultural production, and commercial investments that provided the economic foundation for their extensive religious and social programs. The architectural plans and building records preserved in Cathar archives demonstrate their contributions to the physical development of medieval Languedoc and their integration of theological principles with practical construction needs. The religious centers they built reflected their understanding of sacred space, while accommodating the practical requirements of communities that combined contemplative spirituality with active engagement in worldly affairs. These buildings served not only as places of worship, but as centers for education, healing, and social service. The genealogical records maintained by Cathar communities reveal the extent to which their membership included individuals from all levels of medieval society and the complex family relationships that sustained their movement across generations. These documents show how religious conviction was transmitted through family networks, while also attracting converts from diverse social backgrounds. The presence of nobles, merchants, artisans, and peasants within Cathar communities demonstrates the broad appeal of their religious message. The theological debates preserved in Cathar manuscripts provide insight into the intellectual vitality that characterized their religious tradition and their willingness to engage with competing interpretations of Christian doctrine. Rather than maintaining rigid orthodoxy within their own ranks, Cathar scholars engaged in sophisticated discussions about complex theological questions, producing a body of religious thought that demonstrated remarkable intellectual sophistication. These debates show how religious conviction could coexist with intellectual flexibility and scholarly rigor. The missionary instructions preserved in Cathar archives reveal the systematic approach they took to spreading their religious message and the careful preparation required of those who served as religious teachers. These documents outline the theological training, personal preparation, and practical skills necessary for effective ministry, demonstrating the high standards they maintained for religious leadership. The emphasis on personal example, scholarly competence, and pastoral sensitivity that emerges from these instructions helps explain the effectiveness of Cathar evangelism. The prophetic literature produced within Cathar communities during their final decades reveals how they understood their persecution within the broader context of cosmic history and divine justice. These texts, written as their movement faced extinction, maintained confidence that their suffering served a larger spiritual purpose that would ultimately be vindicated through divine intervention. The hope that sustained them through their darkest hours was rooted in theological conviction that transcended immediate circumstances and connected their struggle to eternal principles. The musical compositions preserved in Cathar manuscripts demonstrate their contributions to the cultural development of medieval Europe and their integration of artistic expression with religious worship. The hymns, chants, and ceremonial music they created reflected their theological understanding while achieving high artistic standards that influenced broader musical development. These compositions show how religious conviction could inspire artistic creativity that enriched not only their own communities, but the broader cultural tradition of which they formed parts. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we're discovering how the systematic recovery of Cathar documents has revolutionized our understanding of medieval religious life and challenged many assumptions about the relationship between orthodoxy and heresy in European history. The picture that emerges from their own writings differs dramatically from the accounts produced by their enemies, revealing a religious tradition that combined theological sophistication with practical wisdom, spiritual dedication with cultural refinement, and principled resistance with genuine humanity. The impact of Cathar ideas on subsequent European intellectual development becomes clearer as scholars trace the transmission of their theological insights through later religious and philosophical movements. The questions they raised about the problem of evil, the nature of spiritual authority, and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional power would continue to influence European thought long after their physical elimination. Renaissance humanists, Protestant reformers, and Enlightenment philosophers all grappled with issues that Cathar theologians had explored centuries earlier. The archaeological evidence recovered from Cathar sites provides material confirmation of the religious practices and social organization described in their manuscripts, while revealing aspects of their daily life that written sources had not preserved. Excavations at Montségur and other Cathar centers have uncovered religious artifacts, domestic implements, and architectural remains that illuminate how these communities organized their practical affairs while maintaining their distinctive spiritual identity. The linguistic analysis of Cathar texts has revealed their contributions to the development of Occitan literature and their role in preserving regional cultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The religious works they produced in the vernacular helped establish literary standards that influenced subsequent cultural development throughout southern France. Their commitment to making religious instruction available in local languages reflected their understanding of the connection between cultural identity and spiritual authenticity. The comparative study of Catharism alongside other medieval religious movements has illuminated common patterns in how alternative spiritual traditions emerged, developed, and responded to persecution throughout medieval Europe. The Cathar experience provides insights into the broader dynamics of religious innovation and institutional resistance that characterize the medieval period, while their ultimate fate demonstrates the effectiveness of systematic persecution in eliminating religious diversity. The psychological dimensions of Cathar resistance to persecution reveal the extraordinary spiritual resources that sustained individuals and communities through decades of systematic oppression. The accounts of their martyrdoms, preserved both in hostile sources and in sympathetic chronicles, demonstrate how religious conviction could enable people to transcend the most extreme forms of physical and psychological pressure. Their ability to maintain dignity, compassion, and hope in the face of certain death provides enduring testimony to the power of principled faith. The social networks that sustained Cathar communities throughout their long struggle against persecution demonstrate the importance of community solidarity and mutual support in enabling minority groups to survive systematic oppression. The complex relationships between perfect, believers, and sympathizers created resilient social structures that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential religious functions. These networks provide models for understanding how marginalized communities preserve their identity and values under hostile conditions. The economic impact of Cathar elimination on the development of southern France extended far beyond the immediate confiscation of property and redistribution of wealth that followed their defeat. The destruction of the commercial networks, craft guilds, and agricultural systems that had sustained their communities contributed to long-term economic decline that affected the entire region. The replacement of local leadership with northern French administrators disrupted traditional patterns of governance and economic organization that had evolved over centuries. The cultural legacy of the Cathars in modern European memory demonstrates how historical movements can achieve symbolic significance that transcends their immediate historical circumstances. The Romantic rediscovery of Cathar history during the 19th century transformed them into symbols of resistance to oppression and authentic spirituality in opposition to institutional corruption. This symbolic transformation has influenced everything from historical novels to New Age spirituality, showing how medieval religious movements can acquire contemporary relevance through reinterpretation. The methodological challenges involved in reconstructing Cathar history from fragmentary and often hostile sources have contributed to the development of new techniques in medieval historical scholarship. The need to read between the lines of inquisitorial records, interpret archaeological evidence, and analyze literary sources for historical information has advanced our understanding of how to study marginalized groups whose own voices were systematically suppressed. These methodological innovations have applications for studying other minority communities throughout medieval and modern history. The theological questions that Cathar thinkers addressed continue to challenge contemporary religious and philosophical thought, demonstrating the enduring relevance of their intellectual contributions. Their exploration of the problem of evil, their understanding of spiritual transformation, and their critique of institutional authority all speak to issues that remain central to human spiritual experience. Modern theologians and philosophers continue to engage with questions that Cathar scholars explored 8 centuries ago. The political implications of the Cathar Crusade for the development of medieval European state power reveal how religious persecution could serve broader goals of political centralization and territorial control. The elimination of regional autonomy in the Languedoc under the pretext of religious orthodoxy established precedents for royal intervention in local affairs that would shape the development of the French monarchy. The techniques of administrative control developed during the anti-Cathar campaign would be applied in other regions where royal authority faced resistance. The international dimensions of the Cathar movement and its suppression illuminate the broader European context within which medieval religious developments took place. The connections between Cathar communities and similar movements in Italy, Germany, and the Balkans demonstrate how religious ideas traveled across political boundaries and how local movements participated in broader patterns of spiritual innovation. The coordinated response of church authorities to these movements reveals the international character of medieval religious institutions. The literary and artistic influence of Cathar culture on subsequent European development extends far beyond their direct religious impact, contributing to traditions of courtly romance, vernacular poetry, and mystical literature that shaped European cultural development for centuries. The troubadour tradition that flourished under their patronage influenced literary development throughout medieval Europe, while their emphasis on spiritual refinement contributed to traditions of mystical literature that would influence later religious and philosophical thought. The memory of Cathar resistance to persecution has provided inspiration for subsequent generations facing religious or political oppression, demonstrating how historical examples can acquire contemporary relevance through their symbolic power. From Protestant reformers facing Catholic persecution to modern human rights activists challenging authoritarian governments, the Cathar example has provided a model of principled resistance that transcends specific historical circumstances. The lessons that contemporary societies can draw from the Cathar experience about the dangers of religious intolerance and the importance of protecting minority rights remain urgently relevant in our modern world. Their story demonstrates how quickly tolerant societies can be transformed into persecuting states when fear and prejudice are systematically exploited by those seeking political advantage. The techniques of systematic oppression developed during their persecution established patterns that continue to threaten minority communities throughout the world. The ultimate significance of the Cathar movement lies not in their theological innovations or their political resistance, important as these were, but in their demonstration of the human capacity for spiritual integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform. Their willingness to sacrifice everything rather than abandon their principles provides enduring testimony to the power of individual conscience and the possibility of transcending even the most sophisticated systems of control through authentic spiritual commitment. The transformation of the Languedoc in the aftermath of Cathar destruction reveals how completely a sophisticated civilization could be dismantled and rebuilt according to the preferences of its conquerors. The region that had once been renowned throughout Europe for its cultural refinement, religious tolerance, and economic prosperity was systematically reshaped into a mirror image of northern French society, with all the rigid orthodoxy and hierarchical control that such transformation implied. The new administrative systems imposed by the victorious Crusaders represented far more than simple changes in government personnel. Every aspect of local governance was redesigned to prevent the emergence of conditions that had allowed religious diversity to flourish in the first place. Town charters that had granted significant autonomy to local communities were revoked and replaced with documents that subordinated all municipal authority to northern French administrators appointed directly by the crown. The legal transformation proved equally comprehensive, as the sophisticated legal traditions that had developed in the Languedoc over centuries were swept away in favour of northern French customary law. The Roman legal principles that had influenced southern French jurisprudence, with their emphasis on written law and rational procedure, gave way to feudal customs that reinforced hierarchical relationships and limited individual rights. Local judges who had administered justice according to regional traditions found themselves replaced by officials trained in legal systems that prioritized royal authority over community autonomy. The economic reorganization of the conquered territories targeted the commercial networks that had sustained both Cathar communities and the broader prosperity of the region. The banking families, many of them with Jewish or Italian connections, who had financed trade across the Mediterranean, found their assets confiscated and their business relationships severed. The craft guilds that had maintained their own religious traditions and governed their internal affairs according to local customs were disbanded and reconstituted under strict Catholic supervision. The linguistic policies implemented by the new authorities revealed the cultural dimensions of their transformation project. Occitan, the elegant vernacular that had produced the troubadour tradition and served as the language of administration throughout the region, was systematically displaced by Northern French in all official contexts. Legal proceedings, commercial contracts, and educational instruction were all required to be conducted in the language of the conquerors, effectively reducing the local tongue to the status of a peasant dialect. The educational reforms that accompanied political conquest targeted the intellectual traditions that had made the Languedoc distinctive within medieval Europe. The schools that had operated under Cathar patronage were closed entirely, while those maintained by Catholic institutions were purged of teachers suspected of harbouring sympathies for the old order. The curriculum was redesigned to emphasize religious orthodoxy and political loyalty, rather than the intellectual curiosity and scholarly debate that had characterized regional educational traditions. The architectural transformation of conquered cities provided visible symbols of the new order that had been imposed upon the region. Cathar religious centers were systematically demolished, their stones often used to construct Catholic churches, designed to demonstrate the triumph of orthodoxy over heresy. The palaces of noble families, who had protected religious diversity, were either destroyed entirely or converted into administrative centers for the new regime, erasing physical reminders of the cultural sophistication that had once flourished under tolerant rulers. The demographic changes that followed conquest were perhaps the most profound of all the transformations imposed upon the region. Entire noble lineages that had supported religious tolerance found themselves eliminated through execution, exile, or forced marriage alliances that diluted their regional identity. Northern French families received grants of confiscated lands, bringing with them different cultural traditions and political loyalties that gradually altered the social composition of local communities. The religious transformation extended far beyond the elimination of Cathar communities to encompass the entire spiritual life of the region. Catholic parishes that had coexisted peacefully with Cathar congregations found themselves subjected to intensive supervision by Dominican friars specifically trained to identify and eliminate any traces of heretical influence. Traditional religious practices that had developed local variations were standardized according to Northern French models, eliminating regional diversity in favor of rigid uniformity. The psychological impact of this comprehensive transformation on the surviving population created lasting trauma that would influence regional identity for generations to come. Communities that had prided themselves on their sophistication and tolerance found themselves portrayed as backward heretics who required guidance from their northern betters. The cognitive dissonance between their own understanding of their history and the official narrative imposed by their conquerors created deep resentments that would periodically surface in subsequent centuries. The resistance that emerged in response to these changes differed fundamentally from the religious opposition that had characterized the Cathar movement. Unable to organize around alternative theological principles, opponents of the new order focused instead on preserving cultural traditions and regional autonomy that transcended specific religious beliefs. This secular resistance proved more difficult for church authorities to combat, as it could not be dismissed as simple heresy requiring religious correction. The folk traditions that developed during this period of cultural suppression served as vehicles for preserving memories of the destroyed civilization while avoiding direct confrontation with orthodox authorities. Stories, songs, and customs that appeared to conform to Catholic requirements often contained subtle references to the old order and implicit criticisms of the new regime. These cultural forms allowed communities to maintain psychological connections to their suppressed heritage while avoiding the persecution that open defiance would have brought. The economic consequences of cultural transformation extended far beyond the immediate confiscation of heretical property to encompass the destruction of commercial relationships that had sustained regional prosperity. The Mediterranean trade networks that had connected the Languedoc to markets throughout the known world depended on trust relationships between merchants of different religious and cultural backgrounds. The insistence on religious uniformity shattered these networks permanently, contributing to long-term economic decline that affected the entire region. The artistic and literary traditions that had flourished under the old regime faced systematic elimination as part of the broader cultural transformation project. Troubadour poetry, with its sophisticated treatment of love and spirituality, was condemned as potentially heretical and gradually disappeared as its noble patrons were eliminated or co-opted. The artistic patronage that had supported manuscript illumination, architectural innovation, and musical composition was redirected toward projects that demonstrated religious orthodoxy rather than cultural refinement. The technological and intellectual stagnation that followed conquest reflected the narrowing of cultural horizons that accompanied religious uniformity. The schools that had maintained libraries of classical texts and encouraged scholarly debate were replaced by institutions focused exclusively on religious instruction and political indoctrination. The natural philosophy and mathematical learning that had flourished in the cosmopolitan environment of the old Languedoc declined as intellectual curiosity came to be viewed with suspicion by authorities who prioritized conformity over innovation. The judicial terrorism that characterized the post-conquest period extended far beyond formal Inquisition proceedings to encompass a broader system of surveillance and control that made normal social relationships increasingly difficult. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious conversations. Family members were pressured to denounce relatives who expressed nostalgia for the old order. And commercial partnerships became dangerous when they might be interpreted as evidence of continued resistance to the new regime. The generational trauma that resulted from this systematic destruction of cultural identity created psychological wounds that would influence regional consciousness for centuries to come. Children who had grown up hearing stories of the golden age that preceded conquest found themselves forced to navigate between family memories and official narratives that portrayed their heritage as shameful error. This cognitive dissonance contributed to the development of distinctive regional identity that combined surface conformity with deep-seated resentment of outside authority. The marriage politics that accompanied territorial consolidation served as vehicles for completing the cultural transformation that military conquest had begun. Northern French families who received grants of confiscated lands were encouraged to intermarry with surviving members of southern noble houses, creating new hybrid identities that gradually diluted regional distinctiveness. These strategic alliances served both to legitimize the new order and to prevent the emergence of coherent resistance movements based on traditional loyalties. The religious festivals and ceremonies that replaced traditional celebrations served as vehicles for demonstrating the triumph of orthodoxy while providing acceptable outlets for community expression. The elaborate processions, pilgrimages, and Saints' Day observances that characterized the new religious calendar were designed to channel popular energy toward activities that reinforced Catholic authority, rather than preserving regional traditions that might harbor subversive memories. The urbanization patterns that emerged under the new regime reflected different priorities and cultural values from those that had characterized the destroyed civilization. Cities that had developed as centers of trade and cultural exchange were reorganized around religious and administrative functions that served the needs of the conquering authorities. The marketplaces, schools, and cultural institutions that had sustained diverse communities were replaced by churches, monasteries, and government buildings that symbolized the new order. The legal precedents established during the anti-Cathar campaign would influence European approaches to religious and cultural diversity for centuries to come. The techniques of systematic persecution, the use of confiscation to fund campaigns against minority communities, and the employment of religious rhetoric to justify political conquest, all became standard tools of state power that would be applied against numerous other groups who challenged orthodox authority. The international implications of the Languedoc transformation extended far beyond the immediate region to influence the development of medieval European civilization as a whole. The successful elimination of religious diversity in southern France demonstrated to other rulers the effectiveness of systematic persecution as a tool for political consolidation, encouraging similar campaigns against minority communities throughout Europe. The precedents established during the Albigensian Crusade would be applied against Jews, Muslims, and later Protestant communities who found themselves targeted by authorities seeking to impose religious uniformity. The intellectual impoverishment that followed the destruction of Cathar civilization represents one of the most tragic aspects of this historical episode. The sophisticated theological discussions, philosophical investigations, and scientific inquiries that had flourished in the tolerant environment of the old Languedoc were replaced by rigid orthodoxy that discouraged questioning and innovation. The loss of this intellectual diversity impoverished not only the region, but European civilization as a whole. The environmental consequences of political and economic transformation reflected the different relationship to land and resources that characterized the new regime. The agricultural practices that had developed under local management were disrupted by the redistribution of property to northern French lords who lacked familiarity with regional conditions. The forestry and water management systems that had sustained local communities for centuries were altered to serve different economic priorities, contributing to environmental degradation that would have lasting effects. The linguistic extinction that accompanied political conquest represents one of the most complete cultural transformations achieved through systematic persecution. Occitan, which had produced some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated literature, gradually declined from the language of administration and high culture to a regional dialect spoken primarily by peasants. This linguistic shift symbolized the broader cultural transformation that had eliminated the distinctive civilization of the Languedoc. The memory suppression that accompanied physical destruction reveals the sophisticated understanding that medieval authorities had developed about the importance of controlling historical narrative. Official chroniclers were commissioned to produce accounts that justified the conquest while minimizing or distorting the achievements of the destroyed civilization. Alternative versions of events were systematically suppressed, creating an official history that portrayed the elimination of diversity as necessary progress toward religious and political unity. The psychological adaptation strategies that surviving populations developed in response to cultural trauma provide insight into how communities cope with systematic oppression. The development of coded language, symbolic resistance, and hidden traditions allowed people to maintain connections to their suppressed heritage while avoiding persecution. These survival mechanisms demonstrate the resilience of human culture even under the most extreme forms of systematic oppression. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we're witnessing the completion of one of medieval Europe's most systematic campaigns of cultural elimination, the transformation of the Languedoc from a centre of tolerance and innovation into a rigidly orthodox province of the French crown demonstrates how completely a civilization can be remade when those in power possess both the will and the means to impose their vision of proper society. The techniques developed during this process would influence European approaches to cultural diversity for centuries to come. The long-term consequences of this transformation extended far beyond the immediate victims to influence the entire trajectory of European development. The elimination of the alternative model of Christian civilization that the Languedoc had represented removed a potential source of innovation and reform that might have influenced the broader development of medieval culture. The precedents established for dealing with religious and cultural diversity would be applied against numerous other communities, contributing to the increasing uniformity that characterized late medieval European society. The rediscovery of this history in modern times has revealed not only the tragedy of what was lost, but also the remarkable achievements of the civilization that was destroyed. The sophisticated theology, elegant literature, and tolerant social organization that characterize Cathar communities challenge many assumptions about medieval European society and demonstrate the possibilities that were eliminated through systematic persecution. Their story serves as both historical tragedy and contemporary warning about the fragility of tolerance and the ease with which diversity can be transformed into dangerous difference. The ultimate lesson of the Cathar experience lies in its demonstration of both the vulnerability and the resilience of human culture in the face of systematic oppression. While the physical communities and institutional structures that sustained their movement were completely destroyed, the principles they represented and the example they provided continue to inspire those who struggle against intolerance and oppression. Their story reminds us that while institutional power may achieve temporary victory, the human desire for authentic spiritual experience and cultural diversity possesses a permanence that transcends even the most sophisticated systems of control. The methodological challenges involved in recovering this suppressed history have contributed to the development of new approaches to studying marginalized communities, whose voices were systematically silenced by those who destroyed them. The techniques developed for reading between the lines of hostile sources, interpreting archaeological evidence, and analyzing cultural artifacts for historical information have applications for understanding numerous other groups whose stories were distorted or eliminated by their persecutors. The contemporary relevance of the Cathar experience extends far beyond academic historical study to encompass urgent questions about religious freedom, cultural diversity, and the protection of minority rights in our modern world. Their story demonstrates how quickly tolerant societies can be transformed into persecuting states, when fear and prejudice are systematically exploited by those seeking political advantage. The techniques of systematic oppression that were developed during their persecution continue to threaten minority communities throughout the world, making their experience a continuing source of insight for those working to protect human rights and cultural diversity. The transformation of southern France in the decades following the Cathar elimination created a template for cultural destruction that would be applied across medieval Europe with devastating effectiveness. The systematic nature of this transformation reveals sophisticated understanding by medieval authorities of how deeply rooted cultural traditions could be permanently eradicated through coordinated application of political, economic, and social pressure. The administrative machinery that emerged from the conquest represented a new form of governance designed specifically to prevent the resurgence of conditions that had allowed religious diversity to flourish. Every level of local government was restructured to ensure that authority flowed directly from the French crown through appointed officials who owed their positions entirely to royal favour, rather than local connections or traditional legitimacy. This centralised system eliminated the spaces of autonomy that had previously allowed alternative communities to establish themselves and develop their distinctive practices. The economic policies implemented by the new regime targeted not just individual families suspected of heretical sympathies, but entire commercial networks that had sustained the prosperity of the old Languedoc. The banking houses that had financed Mediterranean trade found their assets frozen and their operations subjected to investigations that made normal business impossible. Merchant families who had built their wealth through generations of careful cultivation of international relationships discovered that their religious orthodoxy provided no protection against suspicion of cultural contamination. The legal revolution that accompanied political conquest fundamentally altered the relationship between individuals and authority throughout the region. The sophisticated legal traditions that had developed in southern France, with their emphasis on written law and rational procedure, were replaced by northern French customs that prioritized hierarchical relationships and limited individual rights. Local magistrates who had administered justice according to regional precedents found themselves replaced by officials trained in legal systems that treated any deviation from established authority as potentially treasonous. The educational transformation proved particularly devastating to the intellectual traditions that had made the Languedoc distinctive within medieval Europe. The schools that had operated under diverse patronage were either closed entirely or subjected to curricula that eliminated any traces of the scholarly curiosity that had once characterized regional learning. Libraries that had preserved classical texts and encouraged philosophical investigation were purged of materials deemed potentially dangerous, creating an intellectual desert where sophisticated debate had once flourished. The linguistic policies imposed by the conquering authorities revealed the cultural dimensions of their systematic approach to eliminating regional distinctiveness. Occitan, the elegant vernacular that had produced some of medieval Europe's finest literature, was systematically displaced from all official functions and relegated to the status of a peasant dialect. Legal proceedings, commercial contracts, and educational instruction were all required to be conducted in Northern French, effectively cutting local populations off from their own cultural heritage. The architectural transformation of conquered cities provided visible symbols of the new order, while erasing physical reminders of the sophisticated civilization that had preceded it. Religious buildings that had served diverse communities were either demolished entirely or converted to serve exclusively Catholic functions. The palaces of noble families who had patronized cultural diversity were systematically destroyed, their stones often reused to construct administrative buildings that symbolized the triumph of centralized authority over regional autonomy. The demographic engineering that followed conquest represented perhaps the most comprehensive aspect of the cultural transformation project. Northern French families who received grants of confiscated property brought with them different social traditions and political loyalties that gradually altered the composition of local communities. Marriage alliances between conquerors and surviving members of southern noble houses created new hybrid identities that diluted regional distinctiveness while legitimizing the new order. The religious transformation extended far beyond the elimination of obviously heretical practices to encompass the entire spiritual life of the region. Catholic parishes that had previously coexisted peacefully with diverse religious communities found themselves subjected to intensive supervision designed to identify and eliminate any traces of theological deviation. Traditional religious practices that had developed regional variations were standardized according to northern models, eliminating local distinctiveness in favor of rigid uniformity. The folk traditions that emerged during this period of cultural suppression served as vehicles for preserving memories of the destroyed civilization while avoiding direct confrontation with orthodox authorities. Stories, songs, and customs that appeared to conform to Catholic requirements often contained subtle references to the old order and implicit criticisms of the new regime. These cultural forms allowed communities to maintain psychological connections to their suppressed heritage while navigating the dangerous landscape of systematic surveillance. The psychological impact of this comprehensive transformation created lasting trauma that would influence regional identity for centuries to come. Communities that had prided themselves on their sophistication and tolerance found themselves portrayed as backward populations who required guidance from their cultural superiors. The cognitive dissonance between lived experience and official narrative created deep resentments that would periodically surface in various forms of resistance to central authority. The resistance movements that emerged in response to cultural suppression differed fundamentally from the religious opposition that had characterized the Cathar period. Unable to organize around alternative theological principles, opponents of the new order focused instead on preserving secular traditions and regional autonomy that transcended specific religious beliefs. This cultural resistance proved more difficult for authorities to combat, as it could not be dismissed as simple heresy requiring religious correction. The economic consequences of cultural transformation extended far beyond immediate confiscation to encompass the destruction of commercial relationships that had sustained regional prosperity for generations. The Mediterranean trade networks that had connected the Languedoc to markets throughout the known world depended on trust relationships between merchants of different backgrounds. The insistence on cultural uniformity shattered these networks permanently, contributing to economic decline that affected the entire region. The artistic stagnation that followed conquest reflected the narrowing of cultural horizons that accompanied the elimination of diversity. The patronage systems that had supported manuscript illumination, architectural innovation, and musical composition were redirected toward projects that demonstrated political loyalty rather than cultural refinement. The troubadour tradition that had influenced literary development throughout Europe gradually disappeared as its noble supporters were eliminated or co-opted. The technological decline that characterized the post-conquest period revealed how cultural diversity had contributed to innovation and progress in the old Languedoc. The cosmopolitan environment that had encouraged intellectual exchange between different traditions was replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion that discouraged questioning and experimentation. Natural philosophy and mathematical learning declined as intellectual curiosity came to be viewed as potentially dangerous by authorities who prioritized conformity over advancement. The judicial system that emerged from conquest represented a new form of legal control designed to penetrate the most private aspects of human relationships. The formal Inquisition proceedings were supplemented by broader networks of surveillance that made normal social interactions increasingly dangerous. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious conversations. Family members were pressured to denounce relatives who expressed nostalgia for the old order, and commercial partnerships became risky when they might be interpreted as evidence of continued resistance. The generational trauma that resulted from systematic cultural destruction created psychological wounds that influenced regional consciousness for centuries. Children who had grown up hearing family stories of the golden age that preceded conquest found themselves forced to navigate between inherited memories and official narratives that portrayed their heritage as shameful error. This psychological conflict contributed to the development of distinctive forms of regional identity that combined surface conformity with deep-seated resentment. The marriage politics that accompanied territorial consolidation served as vehicles for completing the cultural transformation that military conquest had initiated. Strategic alliances between northern French families and surviving southern noble houses created new power structures that gradually eliminated the possibility of coherent resistance based on traditional loyalties. These carefully arranged unions served both to legitimize the new order and to prevent the emergence of alternative centers of cultural authority. The religious festivals and ceremonies that replaced traditional celebrations provided acceptable outlets for community expression while reinforcing orthodox authority. The elaborate processions, pilgrimages, and Saints' Day observances that characterized the new religious calendar were designed to channel popular energy toward activities that strengthened Catholic control rather than preserving regional traditions that might harbor subversive memories. The urbanization patterns that emerged under the new regime reflected different priorities and cultural values from those that had characterized the destroyed civilization. Cities that had developed as centers of trade and cultural exchange were reorganized around religious and administrative functions that served the needs of conquering authorities. The marketplaces, schools, and cultural institutions that had sustained diverse communities were replaced by churches, monasteries, and government buildings that symbolized the triumph of centralized control. The environmental consequences of political transformation reflected different approaches to land management and resource utilization that characterized the new order. Agricultural practices that had developed under local management were disrupted by redistribution of property to northern lords who lacked familiarity with regional conditions. Forestry and water management systems that had sustained communities for generations were altered to serve different economic priorities, contributing to ecological degradation that would have lasting effects. The international implications of the Languedoc transformation extended far beyond the immediate region to influence approaches to cultural diversity throughout medieval Europe. The successful elimination of alternative traditions in southern France demonstrated to other rulers the effectiveness of systematic persecution as a tool for political consolidation. The precedents established during this campaign would be applied against numerous minority communities who found themselves targeted by authorities seeking to impose uniformity. The memory suppression that accompanied physical destruction reveals sophisticated understanding by medieval authorities of the importance of controlling historical narrative. Official chroniclers were commissioned to produce accounts that justified conquest while minimizing the achievements of destroyed civilizations. Alternative versions of events were systematically eliminated, creating historical records that portrayed cultural elimination as necessary progress toward religious and political unity. The linguistic extinction that accompanied political conquest represents one of the most complete cultural transformations achieved through systematic persecution in medieval Europe. The gradual decline of Occitan from the language of administration and high culture to a regional dialect spoken primarily by peasants symbolized the broader elimination of distinctive regional identity that had sustained alternative approaches to Christian civilization. The survival strategies that developed among populations subjected to cultural suppression provide insight into human resilience in the face of systematic oppression. The creation of coded languages, symbolic resistance, and hidden traditions allowed communities to maintain connections to suppressed heritage while avoiding persecution. These adaptation mechanisms demonstrate the capacity of human culture to persist even under the most extreme forms of institutional pressure. The rediscovery of this suppressed history in modern times has revealed not only the tragedy of what was eliminated, but also the remarkable achievements of the civilization that was systematically destroyed. The sophisticated governance structures, elegant cultural productions, and tolerant social organization that had characterized the old Languedoc challenge many assumptions about medieval European society and demonstrate possibilities that were lost through coordinated persecution. The methodological innovations required to recover this hidden history have contributed to new approaches for studying marginalized communities whose voices were systematically silenced by those who destroyed them. The techniques developed for interpreting hostile sources, analyzing archaeological evidence, and reading cultural artifacts for historical information have applications for understanding numerous other groups whose stories were distorted or eliminated by their persecutors. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we're witnessing the completion of a transformation that would serve as a model for cultural elimination throughout subsequent European history. The techniques perfected during the systematic destruction of Languedoc civilization would be applied against Jewish communities during the expulsions of the later medieval period, against Muslim populations during the Reconquista, and against Protestant communities during the religious wars that would convulse Europe in later centuries. The contemporary relevance of this historical experience extends beyond academic study to encompass urgent questions about protecting cultural diversity and minority rights in our modern world. The systematic approach to cultural elimination that was developed during this period established patterns of persecution that continue to threaten communities who maintain distinctive identities in the face of pressure for conformity. Understanding how such comprehensive destruction was achieved provides essential insight for those working to prevent similar campaigns against vulnerable populations. The psychological dimensions of systematic cultural destruction reveal how deeply such experiences can wound the collective consciousness of affected populations. The trauma inflicted during this period created psychological scars that influence regional identity for generations, contributing to forms of resistance and resentment that would periodically surface throughout subsequent centuries. These long-term effects demonstrate how cultural violence can have consequences that extend far beyond its immediate victims. The technological and intellectual stagnation that followed cultural elimination reveals how diversity contributes to innovation and progress in human societies. The cosmopolitan environment that had characterized the old Languedoc, with its encouragement of intellectual exchange between different traditions, was replaced by an atmosphere of conformity that discouraged questioning and experimentation. This transformation contributed to broader patterns of intellectual decline that affected European development for centuries. The economic consequences of systematic cultural destruction extended far beyond the immediate confiscation of property to encompass the elimination of commercial networks that had sustained prosperity across the entire Mediterranean region. The trust relationships between merchants of different backgrounds that had made international trade possible were shattered by insistence on cultural uniformity, contributing to economic decline that affected far more than the immediate victims of persecution. The legal precedents established during this campaign of cultural elimination would influence European approaches to minority communities for centuries to come. The use of religious rhetoric to justify political conquest, the employment of confiscation to fund campaigns against dissenting populations, and the development of surveillance systems to monitor private beliefs all became standard tools of state power that would be applied against numerous groups who challenged orthodox authority. The ultimate significance of this historical episode lies in its demonstration of both the vulnerability and the resilience of human culture when confronted with systematic attempts at elimination. while the institutional structures and physical communities that had sustained alternative approaches to civilization were completely destroyed. The principles they represented and the examples they provided continued to influence those who struggled against intolerance and oppression throughout subsequent history. The lessons that contemporary societies can draw from this experience about the importance of protecting cultural diversity and preventing the systematic persecution of minority communities remain urgently relevant in our interconnected world. The techniques of cultural destruction that were perfected during this period continue to threaten vulnerable populations, making understanding of these historical patterns essential for those committed to defending human rights and cultural pluralism in the modern era. The intellectual recovery of this suppressed history has fundamentally transformed our understanding of medieval European civilization and revealed the sophisticated mechanisms through which dominant cultures eliminate alternatives that challenge their hegemony. The patient work of scholars who have pieced together fragments of Cathar manuscripts, analysed archaeological evidence from destroyed communities, and read between the lines of hostile chronicles, has reconstructed a picture of medieval society far more complex and diverse than traditional narratives suggested. The archaeological excavations conducted at former Cathar sites throughout southern France have yielded evidence that confirms and expands upon the documentary record of their sophisticated social organization. Pottery fragments bearing distinctive religious symbols, architectural remains of community buildings designed to accommodate both worship and daily activities, and domestic artifacts that reveal high standards of craftsmanship all testify to communities that successfully integrated spiritual dedication with practical prosperity. These material remains provide tangible evidence of the civilization that was systematically erased from the historical record. The linguistic analysis of surviving Cathar texts has revealed their crucial role in the development of vernacular literature throughout medieval Europe. Their decision to conduct religious instruction in Occitan rather than Latin reflected a democratic approach to spiritual education that made sophisticated theological concepts accessible to ordinary believers. The elegant prose and poetry they produced in their native tongue influenced literary development far beyond the boundaries of their own communities, contributing to traditions of vernacular religious writing that would shape European culture for centuries. The comparative study of Catharism alongside other medieval religious movements has illuminated common patterns in how alternative spiritual traditions emerged, developed, and responded to institutional pressure throughout European history. The similarities between Cathar organizational structures and those of later Protestant communities suggest continuities in approaches to religious reform that transcended specific theological differences. Understanding these patterns provides insight into the broader dynamics of religious innovation and institutional resistance that characterized medieval society. The story of the Cathars stands as one of history's most profound reminders that the price of believing differently can be everything. From their emergence in the sun-drenched valleys of medieval Languedoc to their final martyrdom at Montségur, these good Christians demonstrated that human conscience possesses a power that transcends even the most sophisticated systems of control. Their systematic elimination by crusade and inquisition didn't just destroy a religious movement, but erased an entire civilization that had dared to embrace tolerance, intellectual curiosity, and spiritual authenticity over institutional conformity. Here at Obscure Historiesa, we've witnessed how quickly diversity can be transformed into dangerous heresy when fear is weaponized by those seeking power. The techniques perfected against the Cathars would echo through European history, applied against countless other communities who challenged orthodox authority. Yet perhaps their greatest legacy lies not in their destruction, but in their unwavering example of principled resistance. The perfect who walked into the flames rather than abandon their beliefs remind us that while institutional power may triumph temporarily, the human spirit's quest for authentic meaning possesses a permanence that outlasts even its most determined persecutors.